Welcome to the 9 elements of a person-centered system. We're on module 8. We are going to spend our time today talking about alignment. And when we look at alignment, we can notice where there are external and internal advocates that are pushing in the same direction or not. And we can also examine assumptions. For example, one assumption is that the system is the expert and the expert knows best, and that creates dependence on the system. Another assumption is that the person, the family, their loved ones are the experts, and the role of the system then is to enhance or to promote or endorse the capacities of service users. Next slide, Bob. So here's our elephant graphic for the alignment element. In this depiction, the elephants are moving all in the same direction. They're in alignment with one another, focused on what's ahead. So they have an aspirational look about them. They're in different places. They obviously have different capacities, but there's something in front of them that they're moving toward. Our focus for today is on the importance of alignment across the 9 elements, but also across other aspects of your system and organization. We'll talk about the role of pressure and the different types of pressure, both internal and external pressure, and its impact on change and on movement in our system. We'll talk about effectiveness and efficiency and their role in change in your organization. And we'll also give you opportunities for next steps for using these concepts at your work and in your daily activities.
So as we move forward, just a quick recap of what we've done so far. We've really focused on 7 of the 9 elements, knowing that it begins and ends with leaders, and we'll spend a lot of time in our last session really talking about leaders and their contribution to really moving things forward. But element number 1 really is looking at the vision, mission, and values. We've looked at advocacy, both internal and external advocacy. We've looked at trauma-informed discovery and how that needs to be built into the services and supports that are provided for folks. We have looked at the outcomes and the cultural considerations that need to be really addressed when we are developing person-centered plans for folks. And if we are going to make those plans really come to life, how do we really engage the supporters and help them have all of the skills they need to really make this happen? Our last session, we focused on organizational culture and how do we make that shift to a culture that is really a learning culture that focuses on partnership and accountability. All of those key elements really need to be aligned with one another so we can really move things forward. And they are really designed to work in harmony with one another. Unfortunately, a lot of time what happens is they may not be working as closely aligned as they need to be. And really, a challenge in moving the system forward is the competing demands of the system. Each of these elements typically has been designed in its own silo. So they may work well with another element, they may not, because there's not much collaboration as they've really been designed. And this can result in duplicative processes and expectations, and it may even have conflicting requirements for those who are obligated to implement and document these expectations. And it really becomes much more complicated when the standards and requirements are coming from different departments within the system, because each department in the system has its own rules and regulations that they need to be following. And if we really want to make this happen, we really need to think about how do we shift our vision, how do we shift the lens that we're looking through. And as Tanya had mentioned earlier, we for a long time have been operating under this underlying assumption that the system knows best. We are here to take care of people. We are here to provide for their health and safety. And if we really want this to move forward, we really need to think about how we change our assumption, how we change the lens that we look through. So rather than the system knowing best, perhaps we look at a strength-based system, which we have been doing over the years, but taking that one step further to really giving power to the people who are using our services and supports so that they are viewed as the experts of their own lives. As we look at this, we really need to be mindful of there are many different components of the system, and it can't just rest with the assumption, but the assumption is a starting point. We need to look at all of our other pieces of the system and how do they work together. We need to look at intake. We need to look at assessments. We need to look at planning and quality management and the financial responsiveness of how the system operates. And how do we make that shift from that power overview, which we typically have when the system knows best, to a power with standpoint, to really thinking about how are we working in partnership with those who are using our services and supports. I'll just give you a quick example. I come from the provider world, and thinking about assessments, I'll tell you about Troy. Troy is somebody that we provided supports to, and Troy is somebody who, very friendly guy, very independent guy, likes to do a lot of stuff on his own, and is very capable in doing that. Troy also happens to have cerebral palsy, and he's got an unsteady gait. And one time, someone from the system, from a service coordination agency, saw Troy crossing the street, not at the crosswalk. Made it across the street safely. Troy has never been hit by a car, but I, as the executive director, got a call saying, hey, you need to do an assessment on Troy to make sure that he is safe, because he was crossing the street, not at the crosswalks. I have a funny feeling many of us have crossed the street, not at the crosswalks. And I understand we need to keep things safe, and Troy is very safe. As I said, he's never been hit by a car, but we had to hire an assessor to come in and watch him crossing the street at the crosswalk. And he crossed the street at the crosswalk perfectly. The assessment was done. And guess how he crossed the street next time? He crossed the street in the way that was effective for him to get it across as quickly as possible. And it didn't happen to be at a crosswalk. So we have this view that we know what's best for folks. But Troy really knew what was best for him. He knew how to cross the street, and he didn't get hit by a car. In fact, it's 20 years later, and he's never been hit by a car. So we really need to think about, how do we make that shift? And that's really where alignment comes in. How do we really start to work together to make this stuff happen? I'm going to turn it over to Michael so he can talk about what sort of pressure that causes.
So alignment doesn't just happen. If you want change to happen, if you want transformational change to happen, you have to have pressure that exceeds the resistance for change. John Cotter calls it a sense of urgency, and that you have to have and maintain a sense of urgency to get change to occur. But if you start thinking about all of the issues that Bob brought up, they have to happen together. You're looking at how the various pieces work together, and where they don't work well together, you require the necessary pressure to get them to be working together. And people don't like change. So change has to exceed, the pressure for change has to exceed the resistance for change. So there's both compliance pressure and positive pressure. We have found this a very helpful way to kind of look at how we get systems change. Compliance pressure is something we're very familiar with. Everybody's been looking at the change in the waiver and the 1914C in particular, but other changes that are coming down to make things more person-centered. But if you just look at compliance pressure, we are already seeing person-centered plans that meet the letter but don't meet the intent. So when you have compliance pressure, people are looking at, how do I make the least possible change in order to be in compliance? How do I make the least possible change to meet the change in rules and policy? How can I just meet the minimums? And I'm not invested in choice and control for people, and therefore I'm not invested in the underlying values. Where you have intentional positive pressure, you look at generating buy-in. What can we do that'll increase buy-in? What can we do to make sure people see the difference between minimums and the intent? And you have to keep in mind that if it's not worth it to the person, they're not going to invest the energy in it. So the time and effort have to be perceived as worth it to make the change that is needed. And you can't just rely on pressure from the top down or the bottom up. You need both. You need to get the people who are doing the day-to-day work to be invested, and you need the people who are leading the effort to be invested in. That investment that both have needs to be maintained and encouraged. So you need pressure from the top and pressure from the bottom. That top-down pressure begins with reinforcing the values, reinforcing the vision, and the bottom-up pressure requires, at a minimum, people have the skills and are rewarded for their efforts that are aligned.
So the meaning of bottom up is really about progressing from the lower levels of an organization or a system, particularly when something's stratified. It's helpful to think about how we move change up through our systems. And a bottom up approach is a way of making decisions that actually starts from the bottom of whatever hierarchy exists rather than at the top. So in practice, it means that the change won't happen or won't be stimulated by those who are in charge. It'll actually come more organically from people at lower levels of the organization. And bottom-up pressure happens when people who are trained to have opportunities to use the skills to make changes on their own. So at a level 1, and we'll talk about the levels of change in just a moment, people can make changes without permission. It doesn't require that they ask of anyone what they can do. They just see a need and take care of it. And that instantly helps people understand that it can make a difference in the lives of people they support. And it may also stimulate more change because it shows us what is possible for people who are supported. People using skills may also be advocating for changes at the second level of the organization. And that means that they are sharing what works and doesn't work in such a way and being listened to in such a way that it may drive policy and procedure changes in the organization. And there are organizational ways and organized ways to advocate for level 3 changes, so changes that may happen outside the organization. And on the next slide, we can look at those 3 levels of change. This will be familiar to you from some of our other sessions. So change also happens at levels, and there is actually some power in knowing where to apply those pressures that Michael was talking about to both stimulate and to support change. So at level 1, as I said, those are changes that result in a difference in the lives of people who use services and supports or in your own work life. Those changes do not require permission. They are just changes that can be made. So you notice something that needs to change, you make the change. At level 2, any changes that the organization makes to its practices, its policies, its procedure, its structure, its rules, that all result in positive differences that may impact all of the people who use the services and supports of that organization. So it has a broader impact than just one-to-one change may have. It also tells us what's working and not working in an organization when we examine at level 2 where change needs to happen. And at level 3, we can consider any change in practice or structure that happens ordinarily outside of an organization. So it happens at a system level typically. And those changes may have an impact or an effect on many organizations, many people in a similar situation across those organizations. And therefore, it may impact the lives of many more people. So I'll turn you back over to Michael to talk a little bit about top-down pressure.
One of the pioneers in this work, a guy named Fry, said, if you want change to happen, you have to change the path of least resistance. You have to make changes. You have to have changes that make the old way harder and the new way easier. And you have to be thoughtful about that. You have to be thinking about how do we make this change in assumptions work and do it in a way where the new way is easier. One of the earlier efforts in self-direction in many states had a flaw, and that was getting into self-direction was harder than getting into regular services. So the new way was harder than the old way, and so services were underused. But if we look at top-down pressure, when is it effective? Part of what we see is that it's clear what we expect, and that efforts that don't meet the criteria are not accepted. There also has to be the possibility of doing it. People need the skills, they need the resources necessary to be successful. And you can't just say we're going to do it and have change by memo. Change by memo inevitably fails. Pressure that is applied but is actually applied only for a short period of time doesn't work. One of the real challenges is sustaining momentum, which is a way of talking about sustaining pressure. John Cotter talks about you need to have what he calls short-term wins. You need to be able to have efforts that reinforce the idea that this is doable, it has positive outcomes, and that helps sustain the pressure. And then you need to have people who are in the quality management world and in the senior management who look at what's working and not working, can give feedback and suggest changes. This is where Elizabeth Moss Cantor says you need listening posts. You need ways for people to hear what's happening, what's working and not working. You need to be able to have ideas about what's really going on, not what is dressed up and presented as going on. And the people who are listening to that aren't looking to do gotcha, they're looking for opportunities for improvement. Next slide. And you can really tell when pressures are not comprehensive and sustained or aligned. You have people who are saying, what's the least change we can have? And how do we look good in that response? And we have also the foxhole response. If we just keep our heads down, if we just hunker down, if it's a fad, it will go away. Next slide. If we look at the external pressures, the pressures that come from outside the system, the first of those is the federal funding and the federal rule changes. The new final rule would be an example of that. And it comes with an implementation date. So people feel the pressure to be in compliance. But the problem with federal rules is it's compliance pressure, not necessarily positive pressure. So you want to educate your advocacy groups, help them understand what systems look like and how systems work, and then work in partnership with them to get positive pressure for change. When you have lawsuits, you get pressure for change. That pressure may or may not be aligned. And the more your attorneys are educated in the system and the direction you want to go, the more they can present to the courts that being person-centered is not extra. Being person-centered is central to the efforts that will resolve the lawsuit. So much of what we're talking about is in response to the federal change. And one of the ways to look at it is it creates significant opportunities for change, and it removes some of the obstacles. People used to have a path that was the opposite of the path of least resistance. And you would have small entities that were demonstrating best practice, despite the pressures that were counter to the best practice. Now the obstacles have largely been removed from the federal perspective. And so you really need to start looking at how can we capitalize on that? How can we turn that not only into compliance pressure, but positive pressure?
And as we do this, we really need to be mindful about how can we be effective and efficient in making these changes happen. Peter Drucker, great change management guru, says efficiency is doing things right. Effectiveness is doing the right things. And doing the right things when no one else is looking. So we really need to be mindful of, are we being effective and efficient in how we are operating things? If we are having duplicative standards and processes, it's probably not the most effective or efficient. Again, coming from the provider world, if I am working in 7 different areas, each of those areas where I'm providing services may have a different operating system, which means for me, I've got 7 different systems to address the same standards. That's not very effective, not very efficient. And when we've got limited resources, we really need to be mindful about what are we doing to make that work. And if we are really looking at this from a systemic standpoint, if we are being efficient, we need to be efficient by doing the right things, using the fewest resources. How can we really maximize all of the things we have available to us to really support people in the best way possible? One of the things that I find pretty interesting is that nowhere do our rules and regs say we can't be person-centered, so we could have been doing this all along. And we often find that everything we do as a system has to be a paid support. What I find interesting when I review rules and regulations, let's say we're looking at supervision for people we provide supports to. Nowhere in our rules and regs does it say it's paid supervision. Yet that's how we interpret things. And whenever there's an issue in our system, we often have two responses. I need more staff. I need more money. Those are resources that are pretty scarce these days. So we really need to think about how can we do things in a different way? Can we look at resources that don't cost money? Can we look at providing supports in a way that makes sense and maybe it has different partnerships than we've had in the past? We really need to look at things from these 3 points. Are we being effective? Are we managing our costs? And are we still maintaining good quality? If we can do that, then we are starting to make those changes that will move us toward a system where we really are having power with people rather than power over people. And a big piece of that is how do we have all of these things that are in conflict with one another start to align and come together and all move forward in the same direction.
So alignment and moving toward more alignment in our own work and practices, or more alignment in our organizations, or a more aligned system may cause us to need to develop new skills. And when we develop new skill, we develop confidence, we gain courage, we can override fear and anxiety. Bob talked about the regulations where it said, nowhere did it say we couldn't be person-centered. Developing new skills helps us understand that we could be doing things differently. And so when we gain that confidence, we may try things to be a little bit different. We feel more empowered, which can really help us be more effective change agents. So when we look at this across different areas, on the next slide, we can look at it from a systems perspective where change may be more transformational. The expectation may be more broad, and we see more organizations being expected to do things differently. We also see that we can develop a culture where partnership and learning are not only done in isolated pockets, but are really the expectation of how we do our work. So we are to partner with others to increase our resources, to help people have more access to their communities, and really to learn from what people experience when they do access their communities and how we can support them better. So in that way, outliers then are not the norm. It is the expectation, and we expect everybody to be moving in that direction. So it's not only the letter of the law, but it is the spirit of the law. The intent of the regulations is to help us do more person-centered things, be more in alignment with person-centered laws, and that's how the system can be operating. From the service or coordinator or provider perspective, we can think about how we engage with people. So conversations are not interviews, they're not checklists. They are comfortable, and they are about learning about people at their core level. And we are learning about people because we want to know how they want to live their life and how our organization can support them to do that. We also understand that resources are not dependent on what's funded, that resources come in all shapes and forms, and that we can be more creative in what we consider to be resources. Often, if we think about it, resources aren't as scarce as we might ordinarily think. It's the connections between the resources. So when we're partnering more strongly, we understand that resources are much more abundant than maybe we initially thought. We start to look at outcomes for people versus goals. So goals help us measure things and are we making progress towards something, but outcomes really tell us how a person wants to live. And when we have talked about with a person how they want to live their life, when we've spent time in getting to know that person and understanding through discovery what their life looks like from their perspective in balance between the things that are important to them and important for them, we naturally start to understand the outcomes that would support them to have those things in their lives. So person-centered outcomes. And in addition to that, the quality of the results rather than the process. So it's not so much about the things we do, it's the things that we do that help a person move toward a life that they see for themselves in balance, may help us understand if the work we're doing actually has an impact, has a quality. People supported in families also may start to shift in their mindset and even their practices about what's possible versus what they currently have access to or what currently exists. When people have not been exposed to doing things differently, it's hard to dream beyond what currently exists. So this is a shift in mindset that may be possible because of our person-centered approaches. And we can begin to partner with people rather than think about people as being recipients of something, a service or support, or an adversary. So when we talk about earlier earlier in our series, when we talked about advocacy, we talked about the adversarial stance often that happens when we're advocating for the things that we need or want in our lives, when really we should think about that as partnering with others to get those lives that we desire for ourselves. So I'll turn you over to Michael now to wrap up a few concepts.
So H.L. Mencken famously said, for every complex problem, there's a simple answer that's clear but wrong. What we're looking at is a complex system. What we're looking at is something where we really need to sort out how we begin to do this, where we can look at how things work together or don't work together, and how we can figure out how they can work together better and work together in a direction. The direction has to conform to the vision. The question isn't, do people get outcomes? The question is, do people get outcomes that help them move towards a life that they choose? Are we maximizing choice and control? Are we helping people move towards lives that they desire? Are we evaluating it from the perspective of where are the opportunities for improvement rather than what's been done wrong? And are we willing to take hard looks at these things? Are we willing to really look at how can we make this work in a way where they work together and they make the most effective use of resources? Where things don't work together well, where there's friction, where there's wasted effort, then there's a waste then of our scarcest resource. And our scarcest resource in the system is time. How do people spend their time? Where do people look for answers? How much innovation is encouraged? How much do people get clarity about what is expected of them that allows for creativity? And where's the learning from what is tried, what efforts are made? It's a system, and systems have pieces that work together or don't work together. We really have to be thinking about it from a systems perspective with a consistent view of the vision and mission and how it is helping us move in that direction or not. But it is something that is doable. It is something that we have leaders who are demonstrating that we can move the system in that direction. We can have systems that support people if we consistently look for positive pressure for change and look at alignment as we do that. Next slide.
So to wrap things up and prepare for our in-person session, really take a moment to think about all of the components of the self-assessment that Mary Lou typically talks about. Well, we will spend some time when we are together, really thinking about how all of those different components cross all of the elements that we've been addressing. They all fit together, and the assessment can help us think about where are there strengths within our organization and our systems that are really working in alignment with each other? Where are there opportunities to really make some improvements about things? So if you use that assessment and start to look through it with the lens of alignment and how well pieces are working together, we can have a conversation about that when we come back together on September 26th. It's not easy. Alignment is probably one of the toughest things because we've developed so many different systems, so many different processes. And with each of those, we have our forms that really fit to make the system work well. And I don't know about you, but whenever I'm part of a form reduction committee, we tend to always end up with more paperwork. You know, it's like people infuse a piece of their soul into that paper that they created. And you're not going to get rid of my form. But if we really want to look at alignment, we really need to look at compromise. We really need to look at how do we work together for the greater good to move the system forward, to support people in a way that makes sense from a power with standpoint, as opposed to our historical and traditional power over standpoint. That takes time. And as Michael was saying with time, it is a rare commodity. We are all stretched thin. What we really need to look at is we're not going to get more time. I've been looking for a 36-hour clock for I don't know how long. I've never found one. But what I have learned is how do we use our time differently to achieve different results? So thinking about that as you look at the self-assessment and prepare for our time together on September 26th, I hope you have some great light bulb moments that we can talk about and share when we come together. So we will be getting together on September 26th from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock Eastern time. And we look forward to seeing you then. And Mary Lou will be joining us as well to really think about that assessment from a more global standpoint. So thank you for your time today. If you have any questions or anything, please reach out to us through our email or through the team chat. and we will be sure to get back to you and keep the conversation going. So thank you for your time today.